When a man throws another over a bridge in a desperate bid to bury his darkest secrets, he doesn't realize someone is watching. Hidden among the reeds, an 18-year-old hot black girl named Nia makes a split-second decision to dive into the river. What unfolds next is a story of courage, betrayal, and how one girl's bravery uncovers a truth powerful enough to shatter lives. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe that a single act of bravery can change lives forever. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden sheen over the gently flowing river. 18-year-old Nia sat crouched in the tall bushes, her fishing rod resting against a rock. This spot was her haven, a place where the noise of home could be drowned out by the hum of cicadas and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. The scent of damp earth, mixed with the sharp tang of the river, filled the air, and Nia took a deep breath, savoring the rare calm. Since her father's death in a factory accident 5 years ago, Nia's mother, Tanya, had worked tirelessly as a nurse to keep their small household afloat. Their two-bedroom home, with its peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture, was a far cry from what Tanya had dreamed of for her daughter. Fishing wasn't just a hobby for Nia, it was a necessity. A bid catch meant dinner that wouldn't stretch their already thin grocery budget. Today, though, the river was unusually stubborn, the line staying taut but unyielding. Still, Nia didn't mind. Sitting here, away from the endless hum of life's worries, was enough. Her peace shattered when a loud thud reverberated through the air, jolting her upright. Nia instinctively ducked deeper into the bushes, her heart pounding. Peering through the leaves, she spotted a black sedan stopped in the middle of the bridge, just upstream. "What the?" she murmured under her breath. The car's door swung open, and a figure stepped out, moving toward the railing. Nia squinted, trying to make out what was happening. Her breath caught when she saw the figure lean over and shove something, or someone, off the bridge. The splash that followed sent a chill down her spine. The sedan's tire screeched as it sped off, leaving only the faint echo of its engine in the air. Nia's eyes darted to the river, scanning for signs of what or who had been thrown over. Then, she saw it, a hand. Nia froze, panic gripping her. Someone was in the water, unmoving, drifting with the current. Her first instinct was to run, to find someone, anyone. But the river was fast, and whoever that was didn't have much time. "Come on, Nia," she muttered to herself, trying to steel her nerves. She kicked off her sneakers, dropped her rod, and sprinted down the muddy bank. The sharp rocks bit into her feet, but she didn't care. By the time she reached the edge, the figure was already being carried farther downstream. Without thinking, she plunged into the water. The cold was a shock, and the current was stronger than it looked. For a moment, Nia flailed her arms and legs, fighting against the pull of the river. But then, she saw the figure again, closer now, an older man, his face pale and slack, bobbing lifelessly. "Hold on," Nia shouted, though she knew the man couldn't hear her. Pushing against the current, she swam toward the man. Every muscle in her body burned, and her lungs screamed for air, but she finally reached him, grabbing the man under the arms. Nia tried to keep both their heads above water. The man's weight dragged her down, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she wouldn't make it. "No." Nia gritted through clenched teeth. With one last burst of effort, she kicked toward the shore, dragging the man through the churning water. Her fingers scraped against the muddy bank, and she heaved the man onto the grass, collapsing beside him. Nia rolled onto her back, gasping for air. Her chest heaved as she stared up at the sky, now tinged with shades of orange and pink. It felt like hours before she finally turned to look at the man she'd pulled from the river. The man was older, maybe in his 70s, with silver hair plastered to his head. His face was gaunt, and there was a deep gash on his temple, blood trickling down his cheek. Nia's stomach turned at the sight, but then she noticed the faint rise and fall of the man's chest. "He's alive," Nia whispered in relief, but barely. The man's breasts were shallow, his body limp. Nia patted her pockets, remembering her phone, only to realize it wasn't there. She must have left it in her rush to the river. The hospital, the only one in the area, was over an hour away. Even if she found someone to help, they might not get there in time. Nia's mind raced as tried to think. She couldn't leave the man here. The sun was setting, and the riverbank would be crawling with animals soon. Looking back at the man, Nia made a decision. "I'm taking you home," she said aloud, more to herself than the unconscious stranger. The wooden door creaked open as Nia staggered inside, supporting the elderly man's weight with trembling arms. Her mother, Tanya, stood in the kitchen, scrubbing a pot. The clatter of Nia's footsteps on the threshold caught her attention, and she spun around. "Nia." "What?" Her eyes widened at the sight of the unconscious man slumped against Nia's shoulder. She dropped the pot into the sink and rushed over. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. "I found him," Nia panted, her breath ragged. "In the river. Someone threw him off the bridge." "What?" Tanya's voice cracked with disbelief. She hesitated for a split second before moving to grab the man's other arm, helping Nia lower him onto the worn-out sofa. "Why didn't you call someone?" "My phone. I left it at the river," Nia stammered, still catching her breath. "The hospital's too far. I didn't know what else to do." Tanya stared at the man. His face was pale, his clothes soaked and clinging to his frail frame. She took a step back, shaking her head. "This is serious, Nia. We need to call for help." "No." Nia blurted out. "We can't wait. He's alive, but barely. Please, Mom, you can help him." Tanya hesitated, her gaze flicking between her daughter's desperate eyes and the stranger on the couch. Finally, she let out a sharp sigh. "Fine. Move aside." Tanya grabbed her first aid kit from the cabinet and knelt beside the man. Her fingers moved quickly, checking his pulse and lifting his eyelids. "Pulse is weak," she murmured, her voice steady but strained. She pulled a towel from a nearby chair and began cleaning the blood off the gash on his temple. Nia hovered close, watching her work. "Nia, get me some clean water," Tanya ordered. Nia scrambled to the kitchen, returning with a bowl. Tanya dipped the towel in and pressed it gently to the man's wound. "This is deep," she muttered, mostly to herself. "He'll need stitches, but we'll have to make do for now." As she worked, Tanya noticed more signs of trauma, bruises along his wrists, as if they'd been tightly bound, and dark marks on his ribs. She pressed her lips into a thin line. "Mom, is he going to be okay?" Nia asked, her voice small. "I don't know," Tanya admitted, dabbing antiseptic onto the cut. "Now, tell me, what exactly happened?" Nia shifted uncomfortably. "I was fishing by the river when I saw someone throw him off the bridge." Tanya froze, the words sinking in. She turned to her daughter, her expression a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Did you see who it was?" "No, I was too far away, but a car stopped in the middle of the bridge, someone got out, and threw him over." Tanya's hands faltered for a moment before she steadied herself. "You're sure about this?" "Yes." Nia nodded firmly. "It was a black sedan. It sped off right after." Tanya let out a slow breath, her face tightening. "What have you gotten us into, Nia?" Nia swallowed hard. "I don't think that. I just knew he was going to drown if I didn't save him." Tanya didn't respond right away. She focused on wrapping a bandage around the man's head. "We'll keep him stable for now. Once he wakes up, we'll figure out what to do." That evening, Tanya and Nia sat together on the couch. The stranger was resting on a makeshift cot they'd set up on the floor. His breathing was steady, but he hadn't stirred. The old TV flickered in the dimly lit room, the evening news playing in the background. Nia poked at her dinner, her appetite gone. Tanya leaned forward, her arms crossed, keeping an eye on the man. "Breaking news tonight," the anchor announced. "Richard Greaves, a prominent billionaire and philanthropist, has been reported missing." Greaves, known for his extensive charity work and leadership in the Greaves Foundation, was last seen leaving his estate early this morning. Nia froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Mom," she said, her eyes glued to the screen. The report continued, showing a picture of an elderly man with shark features and silver hair. Authorities say his car was found abandoned near the Riverway Bridge earlier today, sparking fears of foul play. A massive search is underway. Anyone with information is urged to contact local authorities immediately. Tanya turned to look at the man lying on the floor. Her stomach churned as she compared his face to the one on the screen. The resemblance was undeniable. "It's him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Nia's eyes widened. "You mean he's the billionaire? The one they're looking for?" Tanya nodded slowly. "Yes, Nia, that man in our house is Richard Greaves." For a moment, they sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "What do we do now?" Nia finally asked. Tanya stood, her expression firm. "We wait. If he wakes up, we need to know what happened. Until then, we keep quiet. No one can know he's here." "But what if the people who heard him come looking?" Nia's voice wavered. Tanya placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze. "We'll deal with that if it happens." This just got a lot more complicated. "Do you think Nia did the right thing by taking the man home instead of calling the authorities? Could her bravery have unintended consequences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're intrigued to see how the story unfolds, don't forget to like this video and keep watching to find out. The first sign of movement came just after dawn. Nia was curled up in a chair by the cot, her head resting against her arm, while Tanya busied herself in the kitchen. A low groan pulled Nia from the edge of sleep. "Mom, he's waking up." Nia scrambled to her feet as Richard stirred, his face twisting in discomfort. Tanya rushed over, kneeling beside the cot. "Sir, can you hear me?" Richard's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused and hazy. His lips moved, but no sound came out at first. After a moment, he managed to rasp, "Where am I?" "You're in my home," Tanya said gently. "My daughter found you by the river." "You were hurt." Richard blinked, his brows furrowing as if trying to process her words. He raised a trembling hand to his bandaged head, wincing at the touch. "The river," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You need to rest," Tanya said firmly, adjusting the blanket covering him. "No, wait," Richard's voice grew a little stronger, though his words were still slurred. What happened to me?" "You don't remember?" Nia asked, stepping closer. Richard's eyes locked onto Nia, confusion clouding his expression. "No, I don't. I can't." His voice trailed off, and his head fell back against the pillow. Later that morning, Richard sat propped up against a pile of cushions, sipping weak tea that Tanya had made for him. His hands trembled slightly, but the warmth seemed to help. Nia hovered nearby, watching him intently. "Did you save me?" Richard said suddenly, his voice steadier now, but still tinged with uncertainty. Nia nodded. "Yeah, I pulled you out of the river. You were floating, barely breathing." Richard's hand tightened around the cup, his knuckles whitening. "The river," he murmured, staring into the tea as though it held answers. "You don't remember how you got there?" Tanya asked, sitting across from him. He shook his head slowly. It's all blurry. I remember driving, there was a car, another car, then, his eyes narrowed, and he winced as if the memory caused him physical pain. "I don't know, I saw someone throw you off the bridge." Nia blurted out. Richard's gaze snapped to her, his eyes widening. "What?" "There was a black sedan," Nia said, her voice trembling slightly. "It stopped in the middle of the bridge. Someone got out, and then they threw you over." Richard leaned back, his face pale, his breathing grew heavier, and Tanya stepped in quickly. "Nia, that's enough for now. He needs time." Nia frowned, but nodded, stepping away to give Richard space. "It's okay," Richard said quietly after a moment, his voice calmer. He glanced at Nia, his lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. "Thank you for saving me." Over the next day, Richard's strength began to return, though his memory remained patchy. Tanya made him light meals, fussing over his condition, despite his insistence that he was fine. Nia, meanwhile, spent every free moment sitting by Richard's side, peppering him with questions. "Do you remember your name yet?" Nia asked one afternoon, leaning forward eagerly. Richard hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Richard. Richard Greaves," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "Like the guy on the news?" Nia's eyes widened. Tanya, who was folding laundry nearby, shot Nia a warning look. "Nia, don't push it." "It's fine," Richard said, waving a hand. He turned to Nia. "The news, huh? What are they saying?" Nia hesitated. "They said you were missing, that they found your car near the bridge." Richard let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders sagging. "So, they know I'm gone." "Good. Why is that good?" Nia asked, her curiosity undeterred. Richard looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "You ask a lot of questions, don't you?" Nia shrugged. "I just want to know." For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then, he leaned forward slightly. "Because it means they're looking for me, and when the right people find me, we'll set things straight." "What things?" Nia pressed, but Richard didn't answer. By the third day, Richard was walking around the house with a slight limp, his strength returning bit by bit. He watched as Nia practiced tying fishing lures on the porch, the girl's hands nimble and focused. "You like fishing, huh?" Richard asked, easing himself into a chair nearby. "Yeah," Nia said without looking up. "It's peaceful, and sometimes I catch stuff for dinner." Richard nodded, leaning back. "I used to fish when I was your age. My father taught me, said it was the best way to clear your head." Nia looked up, surprised. "You don't seem like the fishing type." "Oh?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "And what type do I seem like?" Nia shrugged. "I don't know. You just seem like you'd have other people to do that stuff for you." Richard laughed, a deep, hearty sound that surprised both of them. "Well, you're not wrong. Haven't held a rod in years, but I wasn't always this," he gestured vaguely at himself. "What were you before?" Nia asked. Richard's smile faded slightly, and he looked out at the river in the distance. "A kid trying to figure things out, just like you." In that moment, Nia saw a vulnerability in Richard that made him seem less like a mysterious stranger and more like a person, someone who had lived and struggled and made it through. "Thanks again," Richard said quietly, breaking the silence. "For saving me. It means more than you know." Nia grinned. "You already said that." "Doesn't mean I can't say it again," Richard replied, his smile returning. The morning air was thick with tension as Richard sat on the sofa, absently rubbing his temple. Tanya poured him another cup of tea, her watchful eyes catching every flicker of expression on his face. Nia sat cross-legged on the floor, eager yet apprehensive, as if sensing the storm brewing inside Richard. "I remember now," Richard said finally, his voice low but firm. Tanya paused, her hand tightening around the teapot. "What do you mean? What do you remember?" Richard took a deep breath, his hand trembling slightly as he set the cup down. "The bridge, the man who threw me over." He looked at them, his eyes sharp and filled with something darker than just fear. "It was Alan, my son-in-law." Nia's mouth fell open. "Your son-in-law?" Richard nodded, his jaw tight. "He's married to my daughter, Emma. I trusted him, gave him access to everything, my finances, my foundation, my entire estate." Tanya frowned, crossing her arms. Why would he do something like this? What could drive a man to try to kill his own father-in-law? Richard's expression hardened, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Greed. That's what drives men like Alan." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly as he spoke, each word weighted with anger and betrayal. "For years, I let Alan handle my affairs. I thought I was giving Emma a stable future by keeping him involved, but recently, I started noticing discrepancies. Small at first. Missing funds here, inflated invoices there. But when I dug deeper, he trailed off, his face darkening. What did you find? Nia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I found that Alan had been siphoning money from my accounts for years, Richard said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. He set up shell companies, falsified transactions. He was using my money to fund his own ventures, buying luxury properties, cars, things Emma knew nothing about. Tanya's eyes widened. And you confronted him? Richard nodded. I invited him over to my study late at night. I wanted to give him a chance to explain himself, to own up to what he had done, but when I laid out the evidence, he snapped, claimed I was trying to ruin his life, to destroy his marriage. He said I was jealous of him. Nia frowned. That doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't, Richard said bitterly, but to Alan, it didn't matter. He lost control, started shouting, throwing things, and then, he paused, his hand unconsciously drifting to the bandage on his temple. He attacked me. I tried to fight him off, but he overpowered me. Next thing I knew, I was in his car, and then, his voice faltered. The bridge, Tanya finished for him, her voice tight. Richard nodded slowly, his gaze distant. He must have thought I was dead when he threw me over. He didn't count on someone like Nia being there to save me. Nia straightened, a mixture of pride and unease washing over her. But what about your daughter? Emma doesn't know, does she? Richard shook his head. No. She loves him. At least, she thinks she does. She has no idea what kind of man he really is. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the soft hum of the ceiling fan. Tanya stood by the window, peering out as if expecting Alan to show up at any moment. We can't keep this quiet, she said finally, turning to face Richard. This is attempted murder, Richard. We need to call the police. Richard stiffened, his hands gripping the armrests of the sofa. Not yet, not yet. Tanya repeated, incredulous. What do you mean, not yet? That man tried to kill you. He could come back to finish the job. I know that. Richard snapped, his voice rising for the first time. He softened almost immediately, running a hand through his silver hair. I know, but if we go to the police now without any preparation, Alan will deny everything. He has resources, connections, he'll twist this around and make it look like I'm the one lying. Tanya crossed her arms. So, what's your plan? Just wait here and hope he doesn't find you. No, Richard said firmly. I need time to gather evidence, to make sure Alan can't wriggle his way out of this. I have documents, records, everything to prove what he's done, but they're at my house, in my office. And how do you plan on getting them? Tanya asked. I don't know yet, Richard admitted, his shoulders slumping, but I can't go to the police until I have them. Tanya sighed, her expression torn. Richard, I understand where you're coming from, but my priority is my daughter. If Alan finds out you're here, she glanced at Nia, who was watching them both intently. I can't put my family in danger. I'll make sure that doesn't happen, Richard said quickly. I'll leave if I have to, but please, just give me a day or two to figure this out. Tanya hesitated, her protective instincts warring with her empathy. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained grim. You have 2 days, Richard, but after that, we're going to the police with or without your evidence. Fair enough, Richard said quietly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. Nia looked between them, her young face serious. If you need help, I can, no. Tanya cut in sharply. You've done enough, Nia. You saved his life, but this isn't your fight. But, Mom, no buts, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Richard placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, offering a small smile. Your mom's right. You've already done more for me than I can ever repay. Let the adults handle this now. Nia frowned, but nodded reluctantly, her gaze dropping to the floor. That evening, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Richard sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street. Tanya's words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't blame her for being cautious. Alan was dangerous, more dangerous than anyone in this house truly understood. But Richard also knew one thing for certain: Alan wasn't going to get away with this. Alan Greaves paced the polished floor of his office, his usually composed demeanor fraying at the edges. The news from the private investigator he'd hired was troubling, very troubling. The river search team had found nobody. Richard wasn't where Alan had expected him to be. "This is impossible," Alan muttered, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. He turned sharply to face the investigator, a wiry man with a thick file under his arm. "It's possible he survived," the investigator said cautiously. "The current wasn't as strong that night. Someone could have pulled him out." Alan's lips curled into a sneer. "Someone? Who? That area is practically deserted. Did you find anything? Anyone?" The investigator hesitated before replying. "There was a girl, a local kid. Someone reported seeing her near the bridge that evening, but we don't have a name yet. We're looking into it." Alan clenched his fists, his mind racing. "Find her," he snapped. "And whoever else is involved. I want this handled quietly. No loose ends." "Yes, sir," the investigator replied, already stepping back toward the door. As the man left, Alan poured himself a drink, his hand trembling slightly as he raised the glass to his lips. If Richard was alive, it wouldn't just be his embezzlement that was exposed. Attempted murder would land him behind bars for life. Alan couldn't let that happen. Nia was walking home from school when she spotted the car for the first time. It was sleek, black, and parked just down the street from her house. At first, she thought nothing of it, it was just a car. But when she saw it again the next day, parked in the same spot, her unease grew. "Mom, do we know anyone who drives a black car?" Nia asked that evening as Tanya prepared dinner. Tanya paused, turning to look at her. "Why do you ask?" "I've seen one parked down the street a couple of times. It's just sitting there, no one gets out." Tanya's face darkened. "Nia, listen to me. If you see that car again, you don't go near it. You come straight home, do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Nia said, her voice small. Tanya walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street was quiet, but her gut told her something wasn't right. She glanced back at Richard, who was sitting in the corner, deep in thought. "Richard," she said, "could Alan have people looking for you?" Richard's head snapped up, his expression grim. "If he knows I'm not dead, then yes. He'll stop at nothing to find me." Tanya took a deep breath, her protective instincts flaring. "Nia, you're staying inside from now on unless I'm with you. No exceptions." "But, Mom, no exceptions," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Nia nodded, though unease gnawed at her. She didn't like being treated like a little kid, but the look on her mother's face told her this wasn't the time to argue. The next day, Nia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At school, she caught herself glancing over her shoulder more than once. By the time the final bell rang, she was eager to get home. She took her usual route, cutting through a quiet side street lined with trees. Halfway down the block, a black car rolled slowly past her. Nia froze, her heart pounding as the car came to a stop just ahead. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He looked around briefly, before locking eyes with Nia. "Hey, kid," the man called, his tone too casual to be comforting. "Got a second?" Nia's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the ground. "No, I got to get home," she stammered, taking a step back. The man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It'll just take a second. Come here." Nia shook her head and turned to run, but another man appeared behind her, blocking the way. "Easy, kid," the second man said. "We just want to talk." Panic surged through Nia as she realized they had boxed her in. Without thinking, she bolted to the left, ducking through a narrow gap between two fences. The men shouted behind her, their footsteps pounding on the pavement as they gave chase. Nia's lawn spurred as she sprinted down the alley, zigzagging to keep them guessing. She spotted a dumpster up ahead and dove behind it, pressing herself against the cold metal. She covered her mouth, trying to stifle her ragged breaths as the men's voices grew louder. "Where'd she go?" one of them barked. "Check the alley." Nia's heart thundered in her chest as their footsteps came closer. She closed her eyes, praying they wouldn't find her. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded. "She's gone." "Let's get back to the car," one of them muttered. Nia stayed hidden until she was sure they were gone. When she finally emerged, her legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to keep moving. She ran all the way home, bursting through the front door and collapsing onto the floor. "Nia!" Tanya cried, rushing to her side. "What happened?" They tried to grab me," Nia gasped, her voice shaking. Tanya's face went pale. She looked at Richard, who was already standing, his expression grim. "Alan's men," Richard said. It wasn't a question. "This is getting too dangerous," Tanya said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. Richard sat at the kitchen table, a faint frown etched across his face as he flipped through a notebook Tanya had given him. Nia sat across from him, watching as Richard scribbled dates and figures onto a fresh page. Tanya, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed, broke the silence. "Are you sure you remember everything?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I don't have much choice," Richard replied, not looking up. "Alan was sloppy, but I need to make sure the pieces fit together before I hand anything over." He paused, rubbing his temple as the details slowly came back. There were unauthorized transfers, large sums moved to offshore accounts, ones I didn't recognize. Alan thought he was clever, but the paper trail is there. I had flagged these transactions before he attacked me. "And those records are in your office?" Tanya asked. Richard nodded. "Locked in a safe. If we can get them, it'll be enough to prove his guilt." "But how do we get them?" Nia asked. "Won't Alan be watching your house?" "He will," Richard admitted, "but that's where we'll need help." That evening, Tanya made a call. 30 minutes later, her brother, James, arrived, a retired detective. James carried himself with the quiet competence of someone who had seen it all. "What's going on, Tanya?" James asked as he stepped into the living room, his sharp eyes quickly taking in the tension in the room and the stranger sitting at the table. "This is Richard," Tanya began, her tone serious. "He's in trouble, big trouble, and we need your help." James listened as Tanya and Richard recounted the events of the past few days. By the time they were done, his expression was grim. "So, let me get this straight," James said, leaning forward. "This Alan guy embezzled money from you, tried to kill you, and now he's got people out looking for you?" "Exactly," Richard said, "and I have the evidence to bring him down, but it's locked in my house. I can't risk going back there alone." James scratched his chin thoughtfully. "All right, here's what we'll do. First, I'll have some of my old contacts keep an eye on the house. If Alan has people watching it, we'll know. Second, I'll help you plan a way to get those documents without getting caught." "And Nia?" Tanya asked, her voice tight. "I'll make sure she's safe," James assured her. He glanced at Nia, who was sitting quietly. "You've got guts, kid, but leave the dangerous stuff to us, all right?" Nia nodded, though the determined look in her eyes didn't waver. The next day, Tanya and Richard sat in the living room, a digital recorder between them. The plan was risky, but it might buy them enough time to gather the evidence they needed. "Are you sure about this?" Tanya asked, adjusting the microphone. Richard nodded. "It's the best way to put pressure on Alan without getting away where I am. If he thinks the public knows about his crimes, he'll panic." Tanya hesitated before pressing the record button. "All right, whenever you're ready." Richard cleared his throat, his voice steady as he began to speak. My name is Richard Greaves. If you're hearing this, it means I survived an attempt on my life by Alan Foster, my son-in-law. For years, I trusted Alan with my finances and my family. I believed he had my daughter's best interests at heart, but I was wrong. He paused, his jaw tightening. Alan has embezzled millions from me, using my accounts to fund illegal ventures. When I confronted him, he tried to kill me, throwing me off the Riverway Bridge. But I survived, and I have the evidence to prove his guilt. Tanya gestured for him to wrap it up. To Alan, Richard said, his voice firm. You may think you've won, but the truth is coming, and when it does, there will be no escaping justice. He stopped, the tension in the room palpable. Tanya hit the stop button and exhaled. That should do it. What do we do with it? Nia asked, entering the room. We'll send it anonymously to a journalist I know, Richard said. Someone I can trust to release it without compromising our location. Tanya nodded. And while Alan scrambles to control the fallout, we'll move on the house and get the evidence. Later that evening, James returned with updates. Alan's people are watching the house, but they're sloppy. We can work around them. Richard nodded. Good. Then it's time to move. Tonight. Tanya's eyes widened. Tonight? Isn't that too soon? The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes, Richard said. We've already taken a big risk with the recording. We can't afford to lose momentum. James put a reassuring hand on Tanya's shoulder. I'll keep them safe, I promise. Nia watched as the adults finalized their plan, her heart pounding in her chest. The gravity of the situation finally hit her. This wasn't just about saving Richard anymore. This was about survival for all of them. Alan Foster stormed into his office, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. On the screen, the anonymous video message from Richard Greaves played on a loop. Every word, every syllable, was a dagger to his carefully curated facade. How is this possible? He barked, slamming his fist onto his desk. He should be dead. His chief enforcer, a burly man named Decker, stood stiffly in the corner, avoiding Alan's seething glare. We're working on finding him, Decker said, his voice calm but tense. The broadcast came from somewhere near Riverway. We've narrowed it down to a few neighborhoods. Alan's eyes narrowed. A few neighborhoods? That's not good enough. I want this handled tonight. Find him and make sure he doesn't have a chance to spread another word. Decker nodded, turning on his heel, to relay the order ERS to his team. As he left, Alan leaned back in his chair, his breathing heavy. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. If Richard was alive with evidence in hand, it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. The night was still when the first black SUV rolled into Tanya's quiet street. Nia, peeking through the curtains, felt her stomach churn at the sight. They're here, she whispered, her voice shaking. Tanya immediately killed the lights, her heart pounding. Nia, get Richard and hide. Go to the crawl space under the stairs. Don't come out until I tell you. Nia nodded, grabbing Richard's arm. Come on, she whispered urgently. Richard hesitated. I can't let them, now's not the time for pride, Tanya snapped. Go. As Nia and Richard disappeared into the shadows, Tanya turned to her brother James, who was already loading his old revolver. Are you sure about this? Tanya asked, her voice low. James nodded grimly. They're not leaving here with him. Stay behind me. A loud crash echoed through the house as the front door splintered open. 3 men stormed in, their faces cold and menacing. Where is he? The leader demanded, his voice echoing through the living room. Tanya stepped forward, her heart racing, but her chin held high. Get out of my house. The leader smirked. Lady, you're out of your depth. Hand him over, and we'll leave without any trouble. James stepped into view, his revolver aimed squarely at the man's chest. Looks like you brought trouble with you. Now get out. The man's smile faltered as he took a step back, motioning for his men to spread out. Find him, he growled. The intruders began searching the house, overturning furniture and ripping open closets. Tanya's heart pounded as one of them headed toward the stairs. Hey, she shouted, grabbing a lamp from the side table and hurling it at him. It shattered against his shoulder, knocking him off balance. Before he could recover, James fired a warning shot into the air. That's enough, he bellowed. The next one won't miss. The leader raised his hands, a thin smile returning to his face. All right, old man, no need to get trigger happy, but the tension snapped like a rubber band when Decker appeared from the hallway, dragging Nia out of the crawl space by her arm. Found the kid, he snared. Tanya's blood ran cold. Let her go. Decker laughed. Not until you tell us where the old man is. I'm right here, Richard's voice rang out as he stepped into the room. Tanya turned, her eyes wide with shock. Richard, no. Richard held his hands up, his gaze locked on Alan's men. Let the girl go. This is between me and Alan. Decker shoved Mia toward Tanya, who caught her and pulled her close. Smart man, Decker said, stepping forward, but before he could grab Richard, James fired another shot, this time grazing Decker's arm. Back off. Chaos erupted. The men lunged at James and Tanya, a scuffle breaking out in the cramped living room. Richard used the distraction to grab a fire poker, swinging it wildly and knocking one of the intruders to the ground. Let's go, the leader shouted, realizing they were outmatched. He and his men retreated, dragging Decker with them as they fled into the night. James locked the door behind them, breathing heavily. Is everyone okay? Tanya asked, her voice trembling. Nia nodded, though her hands were still shaking. Richard placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. You were brave, kid. Thank you. The next morning, James called in a favor from an old friend in the force, tipping off the authorities about Alan's crimes and whereabouts. This has to be airtight, James said, handing over the folder Richard had risked his life to retrieve. No leaks. Alan can't know this is coming. By noon, the police raided Alan's estate, finding enough evidence to arrest him on charges of embezzlement and attempted murder. Alan was dragged out of his mansion in handcuffs, his usual smug demeanor replaced with a cold glare. This is ridiculous. Alan shouted at the cameras swarming his driveway. I'd done nothing wrong. But as the evidence piled up, his protests grew weaker. Richard's testimony, combined with the bank records and the anonymous video, painted a damning picture. That evening, Nia, Tanya, and Richard watched the news in silence as Alan was led into the courthouse. They got him, Nia said, a hint of relief in her voice. Richard nodded, though his expression remained solemn. It's not over yet. He'll fight this with everything he's got, but at least now, the truth is out. Tanya placed a hand on his arm. And he can't hurt you, or us, anymore. Richard gave her a small smile, though the weight of the ordeal still hung heavy on his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that justice might prevail. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the back, their pens poised to capture every moment, while spectators whispered among themselves. The tension was palpable as the judge entered, calling the court to order. Alan sat at the defense table, his face impassive but his eyes cold. Richard, sitting across from him at the prosecution's table, met his glare with quiet resolve. The prosecution wasted no time. Over the first day, they meticulously laid out Alan's financial schemes, shell companies, falsified transactions, and millions siphoned from Richard's accounts. Screens displayed graphs, spreadsheets, and emails, each one tying Alan deeper into the web of deceit. On the second day, Richard took the stand. Mr. Greaves, the prosecutor began, can you describe your relationship with the defendant, Alan Foster? Richard adjusted his tie, his voice steady, despite the emotional weight of the moment. Alan is married to my daughter, Emma. I trusted him. I gave him control over my finances, believing he had my family's best interests at heart. And when did you first suspect wrongdoing? About 6 months ago, Richard replied. I noticed discrepancies in my accounts, money missing, unusual transactions. When I confronted Alan with the evidence, he denied everything, became hostile. That confrontation escalated. Richard paused, his voice faltering for the first time. He attacked me, and then he tried to kill me. The courtroom fell silent. And what did he do, Mr. Greaves? He threw me off the Riverway Bridge, Richard said, his voice firm now. He left me for dead. Alan's attorney rose to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, speculation. The judge nodded. Sustained. The jury will disregard the witness's interpretation of the defendant's intent. Richard continued, undeterred. If it weren't for Nia, I wouldn't be here today. All eyes turned to Nia, who sat nervously in the gallery. Nia's palms were slick with sweat as she approached the witness stand. Her mother gave her a reassuring nod, but the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. State your name for the record, the prosecutor said. Nia Johnson, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. Nia, can you tell the court what you witnessed on the evening of Richard Greaves's attack? Nia glanced at Richard, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. I was fishing by the river, Nia began. It was quiet, and then I heard a loud crash. I looked up and saw a black car stopped on the bridge. Someone got out and went to the side of the bridge. Then they threw something over. The prosecutor leaned forward. And what did you see next? I saw a man in the water, Nia said, her voice growing steadier. I didn't know who it was, but he wasn't moving. I jumped in to save him. The defense attorney stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. This is an unreliable witness. She was a child alone, and it was dark. She can't possibly identify the defendant. The prosecutor countered. Your Honor, the witness isn't identifying the defendant. She's corroborating the sequence of events. Overruled, the judge said. Nia continued, her confidence building. Later, I saw pictures of Mr. Greaves on the news. That's when I realized he was the man I pulled out of the river. The trial reached its climax when the prosecution called an unexpected witness, Alan's former business associate, Thomas Crane. As Crane took the stand, Alan's calm exterior finally cracked, his eyes narrowing with fury. Mr. Crane, the prosecutor began, can you explain your relationship with the defendant? I worked with Alan on several business ventures, Crane said, his tone measured. He approached me to help set up offshore accounts and shell companies to move funds from Mr. Greaves's accounts. Were you aware that these actions were illegal? Crane hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but Alan assured me no one would find out. And what happened when Mr. Greaves confronted Alan about the discrepancies? Alan panicked, Crane said. He told me he had to get rid of the problem. I didn't know what he meant at the time, but when I heard about the incident at the bridge, his voice faltered. I realized what he'd done. Why are you testifying today? Crane glanced at Alan, then back at the prosecutor. Because it's the right thing to do. I can't erase what I've done, but I can make sure the truth comes out. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the prosecutor rested their case. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with a verdict. The foreperson stood, her expression solemn as she read the decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, Alan Foster, guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and attempted murder. Alan slumped in his chair, his arrogance finally replaced with visible defeat. The judge wasted no time sentencing him to life imprisonment without parole. As the gavel struck, the courtroom exhaled collectively. Nia watched as Alan was led away in handcuffs, his once pristine suit now a symbol of his shattered empire. Later that evening, Nia sat on the porch of her home, staring out at the stars. Richard joined her, lowering himself carefully into the chair beside her. You okay, kid? Richard asked. Nia nodded, though her expression was pensive. I didn't think it would feel like this. Like what? Nia shrugged. I thought I'd feel happy, like it was all over, but it's not, is it? Richard smiled faintly. No, it's not. Things like this leave a mark. But you did something incredible, Nia. You saved me, and you helped bring a dangerous man to justice. That's no small thing. Nia looked at him, her young face thoughtful. Do you think people like Ellen ever change? Richard shook his head. I don't know, but what matters is that people like you exist. The kind who step up when it matters most. Nia smiled, a small but genuine expression. She felt the weight lifting, replaced by a quiet sense of pride. It was a sunny afternoon when Richard Greaves returned to Tanya's modest home, this time with no shadow of fear hanging over them. He arrived in a sleek but understated car, carrying an envelope and a warm smile. Nia greeted him at the door, surprised but genuinely happy to see the man she had saved weeks earlier. Richard, Nia said, stepping aside to let him in. Good to see you, Nia, Richard replied, clapping a hand on the girl's shoulder. Is your mother home? Tanya appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Richard, she said warmly, though her tone still carried a hint of formality. What brings you back so soon? I wanted to express my gratitude properly, Richard said, settling onto the couch. He placed the envelope on the coffee table, sliding it toward her. What's this? Tanya asked, eyeing it suspiciously. Open it, Richard urged, his smile widening. Tanya hesitated, then picked up the envelope and pulled out a neatly folded letter and a check. Her eyes widened as she scanned the figures, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard, this is too much. It's not nearly enough, Richard said firmly. You and Nia saved my life, Tanya. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here to see justice served. This is my way of ensuring that your family has everything it needs. Tanya's voice wavered. But this is more money than we've ever seen. I don't know if we can accept it. Richard shook his head. Consider it an investment. And it's not just money. He looked at Nia, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. Nia, I've arranged for you to attend St. Gabriel's Academy. It's one of the best schools in the state. You'll get a full scholarship, and anything you need, books, transportation, supplies, it's all covered. Nia's jaw dropped. You mean I can go to St. Gabriel's for real? For real, Richard said with a chuckle. It's the least I can do for someone as brave as you. Tanya blinked back tears, her hand tightening around the letter. Richard, I don't know what to say. Say yes, Richard said softly, and let me do this for you. Tanya nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, thank you, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. A week later, Nia stood in the small bedroom she shared with her younger cousin, carefully packing a backpack for her first day at St. Gabriel's. Her fingers brushed over the new notebooks and pristine uniform, and she paused, taking a deep breath. The past month felt like a whirlwind, saving a life, testifying in court, and now preparing for a fresh start at a school she'd never dreamed of attending. But more than the external changes, something inside her had shifted. Nia. Tanya called from the hallway. Hurry up, or you'll miss the bus coming. Nia shouted back, zipping the bag. Before she left, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. For the first time, she saw more than just a girl from a small town. She saw someone brave, someone capable of making a difference. As she headed to the bus stop, Nia thought about the bridge, the moment she'd dived into the water, without hesitation. That decision had changed everything, not just for Richard, but for herself. She realized now that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about taking action, despite the fear. That Saturday, Richard arrived at their home again, this time with a small gift box in hand. Nia was in the backyard, tinkering with a fishing rod she hadn't touched in weeks. Still at it, huh? Richard said, stepping onto the lawn. Nia grinned. Yeah, it's how it all started, isn't it? It is, Richard said with a chuckle. He held out the box. I got you something. Nia took it, opening the lid to reveal a custom fishing lure engraved with her initials. Well, Nia said, running her fingers over the metal. This is awesome. Thanks, Richard. You earned it, Richard said. He hesitated, his expression softening. Nia, I want you to know. I think of you as family now, like the granddaughter I never had. Nia's throat tightened, but she managed to smile. You're family to me too. Richard nodded, his voice thick with emotion. I'll visit often, I promise, and if you ever need anything, you call me. No matter what. I will, Nia said earnestly. That evening, Nia walked down to the riverbank alone. She stood on the bridge, looking down at the water that had once terrified her, but now seemed calm and inviting. This was where it all began, the moment that turned her world upside down and set her on a path she never could have imagined. She thought about the man who had tried to kill Richard, now sitting behind bars. She thought about Richard's gratitude and the new opportunities waiting for her. But most of all, she thought about how one decision, one act of courage, had changed not just Richard's life, but her own. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nia smiled to herself. The river flowed on, endless and unyielding, just like life, and Nia was ready for whatever came next. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, please give the video a like and subscribe for more.